Welcome to the Long Take Review, a film podcast with one eye always on the Oscar race. I'm your host, Jen Subchak-Jai-Bankard, and I'm here with a friend who's too gross to go to camp or anywhere else ever again. It's Greg Cass. How's it going, Greg?
Do you know how hard it is to stay positive all the time when all you folks do is complain? I'm good, Jen. I am very excited to be here to talk about an animated movie. It's exciting to be back talking about a Pixar movie.
Yes, and it's one that I'm sure this will come up a couple times later, but one that is doing exceptionally well at the box office. It apparently had a huge opening weekend and surpassed Mario Brothers from last year, which I remember that was the big box office story of last year. Was everyone was like, "Whoa, Mario!" So if you haven't figured it out already, listeners, we are here today to talk about Inside Out 2, Pixar's sequel to the 2015 hit Inside Out. So the Inside Out 2 came to theaters this past weekend. You know, presumably it will appear on Disney Plus sometime after its theatrical run, though with it doing so well, that theatrical run might be all summer. Which actually I think Elemental was all summer, right?
Yeah, they allowed it to kind of churn
on.
away, and then I think Disney is back to doing the VOD window and then Disney Plus. So they're going to milk this one. I'm sure it'll be Christmas time before we see it on Disney Plus.
Oh, right, that's probably true. So go see it in theaters. Everybody else is apparently. So the premise of this sequel is that it checks back in with its main character from the first film, Riley. She was much younger in the first movie. Now she's turning 13. She's just hitting puberty. And because of that, she's gaining several new, more complex emotions. And that is sort of where the excitement and the conflict of this new film comes from. If you've seen the trailer, then that's very apparent. So we wanted to note there are some notable casting changes, just because if you go see this movie in the theater, you actually might not notice for a couple of these. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, once we get into it. But Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling, who were in the original, are out, and Tony Hale and Liza Lapira are in as Fear and Disgust. So if you watch the movie and you're like, oh, the voices sound weird, they're different people in some cases. There are also a series of high profile new cast members, including Maya Hawke, Ayo Edebiri, Paul Walter Hauser, which I'm going to be honest, didn't notice that was him in the movie, Ron Funches, and Adele Exarchopoulos. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Apologies if not. So yeah, there's a lot to be excited about. I'm excited to talk about it. If you are listening to us for the first time, we have a spoiler-free section designed for those who have not yet seen the film. And then with a very clear spoiler alert, we will shift into spoiler mode for the rest of the show. So hopefully I said spoiler enough times that you know what's going on. Greg, if listeners think we're in touch with our emotions after listening to this episode, what can they do?
Well, Jen, thank you for asking. If they don't want to cast us to the back of their minds and they don't want to miss new episodes when they drop, the best thing to do is follow the Long Take Review wherever you are currently listening to it. We, of course, appreciate likes and reviews and all those good things that help us get a little more fame and fortune and feel better about our emotions. So we also host the feed on Substack at Jen's excellent thelongtake.substack.com, and people should be subscribed there as well, especially right now because Acolyte reviews are dropping weekly. And you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, anywhere you find good podcasts. You can throw our RSS feed into that. And finally, find us on the socials, including Instagram and Threads at The Long Take Review. On Letterboxd, the social media platform for discriminating cinephiles, we are LTR Pod.
Thanks, Greg. So we are just about ready to get into our discussion of Inside Out 2, but first, we have a quick movie news update.
Just in off the wire, it's your Hollywood news.
All right, so Greg was really good at reminding me, and PT probably would be annoyed with us. He couldn't be here today, but if we didn't cover this news, he'd probably be like, hey, what's going on, guys? Greg, what's the news?
So the big news off the Hollywood wire is Sony purchases Alamo Drafthouse, which I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think came as a pretty big surprise to most people. So if you don't know the extended kind of history of this, is that in the early part of the 20th century, all the movie studios owned their own kind of theater chains and were vertical monopolies, right? So that they could channel everything within their own pipeline. And there was a set of laws put in place that broke this up because it was decided it was a monopoly. And those laws were named after Paramount because they were the ones who were sued that created the guidelines. And then basically 3, 4, 5 years ago, basically the court system was like, yeah, movie theaters aren't a threat anymore, and or movie studios. And so since there was no chance of this vertical integration damaging consumer choice, those laws got taken away. And so in one of those moves now, Sony kind of out of nowhere has purchased the Alamo Drafthouse movie theater chain. Now, as Jen alluded to, PT is the member amongst us who is the diehard Alamo member. He has I don't know what they call their version of stubs, but he has the membership where he can go many times. It's always, he's the first to advocate for the pre-show and for the atmosphere. And I think PT is a really good example of like the Alamo Drafthouse brand has been for serious moviegoers. And I would say their reaction is, it's not good, Jen. I think they're really worried about how Sony's going to potentially screw that up, because it is such a kind of boutique experience in the theater landscape right now. So, Jen, react to any part of that, or kind of what your first thoughts were when that came through?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the thing I've heard the most in terms of speculation is that this is an opportunity for Sony to sort of foist exclusive content into this theater chain now, which I think is really antithetical to the brand that you're referring to, because, and I say this with love, to me, Alamo Drafthouse, and I say this only having been to one once, but it's sort of like the hipster of the movie theater chains. You know, it's the like, we're about real cinema. We get you movie lovers. Like, we're for people who are serious. We kick people out if they text on their phone even once, right? So to have a big corporation like Sony to have Alamo Drafthouse as a resource. Like, I'm not saying they're gonna, like, you know, reskin the entire thing so that you can't recognize it anymore. I do think they understand that they have a valuable brand, but I'm just worried that they're going to be like, oh, we have this movie theater chain. Let's make it so that, the next, the the director's cut of Madam Web is only appearing in the Alamo Drafthouse. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's kind of where we're headed inevitably, just from a financial, it would be weird for Sony not to try to do something like that. And so that, I could definitely see members like PT being kind of annoyed if that's interfering with the regular programming that they have.
Morbius 2 Back in the Shadows was the joke I was going to reach for. So as long as
great.
we can kick both terrible recent Sony releases. And I think you hit the nail on the head, which is there are possibilities here, and I'll try to take the positive spin in just a minute. But I do think Sony at the moment as a brand, people are often left scratching their heads. The whole Spider-Man situation is bizarre. I remember when No Way Home came to theaters, and I think the first credit scene is the Doctor Strange 2 trailer, and people are like, yes, we're back, like that's Marvel and so good. And then the second one is the like Venom, and you're like, oh right, this is still a part of the experience of these characters. And the Venom 3 trailer is now circulating. I think I saw it attached to Furiosa or maybe something else. So I do think Sony is in a precarious spot, and so it's interesting that they're buying this particular brand, as you alluded to. So I read about this David Chen, who is one of the main hosts on the Filmcast, and has an excellent Substack. If you're listening to us on Substack, grab his Everything Decoded. Decoding Everything.
Because that's his brand, right. Is decoding fill in the blank, decoding TV, right? Decoding everything.
Yeah. So in his newsletter, Decoding Everything, he walked through some of what's going on with this. The CEO of Sony has said in the past that he thinks the theatrical experience is ripe to do more kind of live events, which I think is something that could fit into that brand. I am not a member at Alamo. I've been twice, including one very awkward experience where I was the only one in the theater for The Phantom Menace and had a private waiter. And when I'm tempted to go there, it's because they do like early screenings. So right now they are advertising to me heavily in my Instagram. We have Kinds of Kindness a week early with a live streamed Q&A. And I think the same for
Oh, wow.
Maxine. And I think like those kind of events fit this brand really nicely and could be a way for Sony to leverage that, right? And it wouldn't be so bad if it's like, okay, Spider-Man is everywhere, but if you go see it at ours, you could get a Q&A with Tom Holland or 3 deleted scenes attached to the back. I think that kind of, gimmickry would be okay. The other thing, which I hadn't known until reading David Chen, was Sony's CEO has recently pointed out that movie tickets are just too overpriced right now. And I will offer a little bit of a preview of our discussion of Inside Out 2 to say I thought it was funny. I looked for Thursday night tickets to take my 2 kids, or Thursday afternoon, kind of that first round. And I opened up the IMAX screen and there was nobody in it. I was like, oh, geez, like this isn't going to do that well. And then I opened up the similar time frame digital projection, which was $5 cheaper per seat. And it was entirely full. Like I got 3 of the last few seats. So I think he has a point that people who are staying away from theaters right now, part of it is expense, especially on a family movie. And if you could, he argued, this is a number of years ago, but he argued, knock the price down $10, you'll make it up in volume and in snacks. And I think that's the right thinking and could be something beneficial to the business right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think IMAX, the Inside Out 2 crowd, especially families being like, oh, great, a movie I can take my kids to, not overlapping with the premium large format or PLF crowd, right? In terms of like, the movie type of movie you think would be justified for that higher price. All right. So yeah, we'll keep an eye. We got our eye on you, Sony. We'll be watching, always watching, to reference another Pixar movie. All right, so let's get into our short takes of Inside Out 2. Greg, what was your relationship with Inside Out, the first movie? I almost was going to say Inside Out 1, but it's not actually the name of the movie. And, your general reaction to Inside Out 2. How'd you like it?
Let me say that as a part of these comments, I'm going to try to give my Mount Rushmore of Pixar movies and challenge you to do the same. And I offer that now so that you can think about it.
I appreciate that.
I would say, I think Inside Out 1 came out in 2016, which is our upcoming Oscar Fairy episode, or whenever we schedule the next one. And that happens to be kind of in a dead zone for me for movies. So that would be the summer of my son was born. Is that right? No, that's the year after my son was born. I keep forgetting what year he was born. But it was in this kind of moment where I wasn't going to as many movies and I wasn't yet taking my kids to animated movies in particular. So I don't think I saw Inside Out in theaters, but I remember the kind of buzz around it and how people said it was a masterpiece. And so I saw it originally on video and, well, or streaming, whatever, but at home. And I instantly put it up at the highest level of Pixar films for me. I think this is such smart world building and entertainment that I love that. So my Pixar Mount Rushmore would probably be Toy Story 3, which I cannot see frames of without crying openly. I would say Inside Out. I'm a weirdo, so I would say WALL-E is in that mix for me. And the last one might be Up, but on the right day, another Toy Story could knock it out. I think it's just hard to have 2 Toy Stories on the Mount Rushmore. So
I agree. Like, yeah,
go for it.
I would just want a Toy Story the series slot on mine, probably, just because it's hard to pick one Toy Story movie, though. My daughter, when she was like a toddler, wanted to watch Toy Story 2 nonstop for whatever reason. And so I've just seen that movie way more times than all the other ones. So maybe I have an attachment to that. Yeah, like this is a really good question. I was not prepared to answer, but I would say on mine, I like the WALL-E choice, but to switch it up a little, I really like Ratatouille. Finding Nemo probably would be up there for me. Do I go Coco?
Oh,
That might be
Coco's
what I
good
go
too.
with. Coco's really good. Coco is one of those ones that just makes me bawl every time I see it. Like, yeah, but maybe that's what mine looks like. Though I really like your picks too. Up, I have a weird relationship with because I saw that in a theater by myself with someone who was sobbing the whole time. Um, Cause just for probably for other reasons, you know what I mean? Like they were like having like they had just broken up with somebody or something. Clearly, like it was a person who came in sobbing and with like 7 shopping bags, and so I'm like, oh no, like you're
Oh,
going through something,
yeah.
obviously. And then I sat
They're
down and
in
was
it.
like, I wonder if anyone else will come into the theater, and they didn't. So
What's your relationship to Inside Out 1? But and then we'll both give our thoughts on Inside Out 2.
right, because I notably did not mention Inside Out, the original Inside Out,
Mm.
just now, right? So, and I think it because when I originally saw it, I think it was a movie that I admired the concept more than I enjoyed the experience. And that said, again, I ugly cried in the theater and made like terrible noises while crying when during the Big Bong's section of
Mm.
Inside Out. So it's not like that movie didn't affect me at all. But I think if I'm ranking against the other ones, because it is kind of more abstract, like I appreciate the cleverness of it more than it like it has a place in my heart necessarily, if that makes sense. Also, I just resented having to ugly cry in front of a bunch of my friends when I saw the original Inside Out. It was really bad. And it was one of those ones where I tried to hold it in, and that made it worse. I was like,
Yeah.
ah!
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, so it's up there. I definitely think Inside Out, the original Inside Out, is definitely top, like in the top 5, probably from 5 or 10 for me. Like it's upper tier Pixar, but it's not really making it on my personal favorites list, probably.
Well, I'll just say that because I hold the first one in such high esteem, that made me very nervous as soon as they announced the
Mm.
sequel. I think this will be a large part of our conversation today, but there is this narrative going on about how Pixar is struggling, so they're just going to pump out sequels because they're easy money. And that immediately made me very nervous. So, like I've said of other franchises, the first rule has to be first do no harm, right? And I would say this passed that test. I don't think this in any way kind of hurt my appreciation for Inside Out, the original. And I largely had a good time. I think it's a little shaggier. It still would fall into the category of it's unnecessary to me, but it is a solidly good movie that builds on a lot of the strengths of the first one. And I'll just tack on my 8-year-old really loved it, said it wasn't quite as good as the original. My 4-year-old seemed totally confused by the whole experience, but ate popcorn and had a great time. So how did you/your kids enjoy it?
So I was with you in terms of like I had largely written this off because it was a sequel. I'm like, and because of kind of the general state of Pixar, I was very conservative with my expectations. Where I'm like, oh, like I'll definitely go see this, but I'm not going to expect too much. And so it definitely exceeded my expectations. I'd say this is like a solid family kids movie. I laughed a lot, probably more than I did with the original. We'll talk later about like whether or not that's good for the story, because
Mm.
like the parts that I laugh the most at are the parts that I also feel like don't really belong in the movie or just like don't fit with the rest of the movie, and I'm just like, why is this here? So I agree with your Shaggy comment. For me, actually, it's that the premise that made the first one so brilliant, it's not quite scaling up with the complexity of the character maturing. I think because I think the whole point of the second one is, oh, she's getting older, she's hitting teenage years. That everything's going to get a lot messier, everything's going to get a lot more complicated, and I feel like it after a certain point doesn't quite know what to do with the added complexity. Like I think that
Mm.
the concept of, and this is what makes the first one so brilliant, of like we're going to take something so abstract and intangible as emotions and we're going to really literalize them in terms of these characters, and everything about how the brain works and memory works and how emotions work, we're going to turn that into something that's very concrete. And I think that's what makes the first one so amazing. I think that's still largely functioning, but I think there's an elegance to the first one because we're dealing with with simpler emotions, right? Joy, sadness, anger, right? Those are pretty straightforward emotions. But I think once we introduce these more complex emotions into the mix and then start to talk about things like belief systems and selfhood and like who you are and your personality. Like it gets into a little bit more existentialism that I feel like I just started to see. It doesn't break, but I feel like the system that's set up in the original one just starts to, the word I use in my letterbox review is buckle. Like it just you can feel the strain and it's like, we don't quite know how to do this now. Like, and so I think it does kind of conceptually fall a little bit short for me at the end. But that said, I found it very entertaining, had a great time. My kids really liked it. My daughter, who's 7, she had seen the original Inside Out a while ago, but didn't really remember it. So we rewatched it this week, and she was way into it and she really loved it. And so she was actually really excited to see the second one. I'd say she really liked the second one as well. My son, who's 4, so it's interesting that he's about to be 5, and I asked him just as curiosity, because I was like, I don't know how much of this he's getting, like sort of like you said, but I asked him which one did you like better, Garfield or Inside Out 2? Because we had just recently seen Garfield together, and he said Inside Out 2 immediately, and I was like, oh, why? And he said, because it's crazier. Like he's like it's more like, I think he meant like it's more exciting, like more interesting, and I think he was trying to say it was more interesting to him. And so I'd like to interpret that as like he understands what good movies are, and like Garfield, while it was funny, doesn't make any sense. Like the plot doesn't make any sense to me. Like, there's not a whole lot going on other than like Garfield eats lasagna. And there's this whole like indoor outdoor cat. This is not a Garfield review, so I'm not going to get into it. But yeah, it's weird. It's a weird movie. And so I appreciated that he couldn't articulate it, but it seemed to recognize that there was something more complicated happening in this movie.
It's always interesting as a parent to watch kids, and like they might not have any idea what the plot of a movie is, but they can kind of vibe with it or not vibe with it, and as a part of that. And my son, again, who's just about to turn 9 next week, so on the upper age of 8, he is now like revisiting things and he understands them, whereas before he just kind of liked this. So we just did all the Spider-Man movies, and it's like, oh, he really understands the plot now and why characters are doing certain things, and
right, not just
so
like, oh, cool superhero jumping around.
Yeah. Oh, he's swinging. That's great. So, yeah. So I do think it's interesting that Pixar movies, I think, became the brand they are by working on both those levels, right? Grown-ups are ugly crying when Jessie the cowgirl gets left under her bed for so long, but kids are just like, wow, look, there's a horse now, and it just they figured out that formula. And I think, speaking for myself as a parent, when imitators get that formula wrong, it is so obvious. And Pixar has gotten it wrong too a few times, but it just all falls apart when you think it's just Robin Williams' genie making jokes on one side to the parents. It's got to be something more and something thematic, and this movie felt like a return to that. Which I'll start with heading into the recommendation algorithm that way. So, I'm going to say the catchphrase because Jen always gets to.
Do it.
The recommendation algorithm, in which we establish the audience of a film.
Nicely done. Yeah, so this segment acknowledges that not every film is for everyone. Obviously, we've been talking about kids and families, right? Because this is a Pixar movie. But, beyond that, and actually, this was what you just said was a perfect segue into my first question about this, is like, how is this doing on that scale, like of being both for parents and for kids? I think the categories I had set up were like kids now versus kids who grew up with the original, right? Which would be older, versus adults. Like, who is this movie actually for? Who's the primary audience of this, do you think? Or is it doing that sort of dual audience thing nicely as the best Pixar movies do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll just bounce it off the first one, because Inside Out, I think, put at the core of it the relationship between Riley and her parents, and that's why her parents are really well cast. It's Diane Lane and Kyle MacLachlan, and then in this one, you're like, wow, they didn't give those two really famous actors that much to do, but they just because that relationship is at the core, I think it did that two audience thing very well. My guess is that this one might skew a little too abstract for some kids. I don't think it'll lose them entirely, but I think plays a little more to the adults. While the parents aren't a major part, I think they play a little bit more with nostalgia and, understanding. I think just the word puberty being featured prominently in this film means like adults are going to understand this much better than kids will necessarily. Not that kids will bump on that and lose their
Well,
immersion or what have you, but
they actually just don't take a lot of time to explain what puberty is.
yeah.
So I think it is a thing that's like just there as a cue for adults to be like, oh no, we know what that is, but they don't actually delve into it enough. Like, because I feel like if I asked my daughter what puberty was when we left the movie, I don't think she could tell me based on what's in this movie. You know what I mean? Whereas
Yeah.
I asked her about some of the new emotions and she could actually give me pretty good definitions of them. So
nice.
yeah, like I was impressed, like, and very saddened by her understanding of anxiety after this movie, which we'll talk about in spoiler mode.
I mean, other recommendations, it seems obvious if people liked the first one. And I think you're in for more of the same experience. I think we've referenced before a few times. I'm a huge Good Place fan, and this felt like it was activating the same parts of my brain as Good Place. It's like kind of silly, fluffy entertainment, but just a little edge of like really thoughtful, borderline quasi-academic discourse. That all works for me. And maybe again, just answers your question with it skews a little more adult this time around.
Yeah, I would say that too, because I think if I think about the sort of more basic primal, that's a funny thing, that's an exciting thing to watch as a kid, there's much less of that in this than the first one. I think the humor is actually a little bit more sophisticated than the first one, which is probably why I laughed more, but maybe my kids were like, what's like, I think one of my kids was like, what's a secret? I think my son asked me that or something like that. And I was like, oh, right. Like, that's actually a pretty advanced concept. Like, why would you know what that is? It's interesting. And so much of this is focused. I think we should say the plot premise is like much more focused on Riley and her peers, because you mentioned the parents aren't in this one as much.
Yeah.
So it's less about parenting and it's more about adolescence, which makes sense based on the plot. But like, I imagine that if you are a teenager or about to become a teenager, this is actually very helpful. But if you are too young to really understand what a teenager is or know that that's a thing that's coming, then maybe a lot of this is lost on you, right? Also, maybe if you really like hockey.
A lot of hockey.
This movie leads way more into the hockey than the first one. Which Colby from the Colby cast, I think I saw him post that he thought this movie is excellent. And then when I saw it, I was like, oh right, he's a huge hockey nerd. So like, makes sense. Because this actually is kind of like maybe to go with recommendation algorithm, this is sort of a sports movie also. Like it does have a lot of the sort of like, there's not like a game that they're working towards to win or something like that, but it does have a similar feeling of like someone who's trying to be good at a sport and it's like a roller coaster along the way. But yeah. Do you feel like people can see this without having seen Inside Out? The first movie?
I think both movies feature like an opening 10 minutes that really goes through the rules. And I think if you hadn't seen the first one, the opening 10 minutes would get you there, but you would probably still be like, this is weird. And I just, part of my Father's Day gift yesterday is my son and I started watching the new season of Doctor Who. And it's very similar that when there's a new doctor, they do like a basic primer episode where they're going through the rules of this universe. And I was like, come on, like, yes, it's bigger on the inside. We know all this. And my son's like, whoa, like he's an alien, like and went through all the beats. And so I do think that they have crafted it so, hey, in a couple months when you grab that Disney Plus remote, if you see it sitting there, you could grab it and still enjoy it. Although I guess if you had Disney Plus, you'd also have Inside Out there. So you could start there. But possible, but probably not recommended would be my response.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of shorthand with the characters who have supporting roles that I think you're just gonna be like, I don't care about these characters unless you've seen the first movie. Like in particular, Anger and Disgust. Like Anger, like kind of is a lot more chill in this movie and nice. But I feel like you don't appreciate that. Like clearly he's been on an arc that we didn't really see in the other movie. You know what I mean? Like, because he's very much a supporting character, but his role in this movie actually like is like pretty supportive of the other
Mm.
characters in a way that seems contradictory to someone named Anger. But I feel like you understand him as a character a lot more, for example, in this one, if you've seen the first one. So yeah, I would say it would be it's an odd choice, but if it's like your kids want to go see Inside Out 2 and you haven't had a chance to watch it, I think you're gonna be fine.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're ready for spoiler mode. So if you have not seen Inside Out 2 and you do not want it spoiled, it's in theaters. Go join the throngs of other people who have apparently gone to see this movie this weekend and rejoin us for the rest of the conversation. All right, so I think the word on the street from all critics, regardless of what their feelings are about this movie, I often hear the caveat of this is not as good as the original. Most people are like very positive on it to be like, it's great. I had a great time. It exceeded my expectations. It's still not as good as the original. So I wanted to start
Mm.
with like us trying to dissect why that is. And we've kind of alluded to a couple things maybe that could be candidates for why. But yeah, is there anything else you want to add in terms of like, why is this one not quite reaching the heights of the original?
So I do think, because now we're in spoiler mode, we can give a shout out to Jane Squibb as Nostalgia, who comes in twice and gets kicked out because they're not ready for nostalgia yet, which is a pretty good gag. But
It's so
I would
funny.
say some Jane Squibb nostalgia glasses are a little bit on critics, and you said you just showed your daughter the first one again, and my kids and I sat down and watched the first one, I think Tuesday before we saw the new one on Thursday. And I would say that I was reminded that the first one isn't a complete flawless masterpiece. I will speak only for myself in saying that, like, there's a extended sequence in Dreamland that I was like, oh, I don't like any of this. And there's like an extended gag into the realm of abstract thought that is pretty silly and mostly works and does some cool animation things. So I'm going to give it a pass. But I was like, there are bits of this that I completely forgot were a part of that, because I kind of remembered the emotions and the ways in which they helped Riley, and this kind of great message about how all our emotions are what makes us us. And so I think critics are feeling that a little bit when I see some of the complaints that this is a little sprawling. It's kind of like, the first one's a little sprawling too. But I'll offer one piece that I think is maybe not the what comes to mind first necessarily, but I thought what this film did really nicely is kind of express how puberty uh, happens over the course of like 3 or 4 years, and they set that into 3 days of a hockey camp weekend. I've never experienced a hockey camp weekend, but like the idea that anxiety can overwhelm you and let your other emotions slide away and so on, that like totally works for me. There was a weird complaint too that like when we'd seen the parents inside the parents' heads in the first movie, there were none of these other emotions. And I kind of like this idea that puberty is when all these emotions come in and then they get kind of stowed away and you're back to feeling your joy, your sad. Like that totally works. But like puberty is not 3 terrible days. It's like a really long set of terrible years.
Yes.
So I think that's, to me, it's a little nitpicky, but it's like, I think in trying to stretch this and condense this, it something gets lost in that translation there.
Yeah, and I think the fact that puberty is like a siren that all of a sudden goes off one day, and when they wake up one morning, they're like, "What's this?" And all of a sudden it's there. Like, yeah, I think they're and I think that paired with puberty itself not actually being the subject of this movie, I think is where
Mm.
the problem is. Like they made such a big deal about it at the beginning. And yes, like it does coincide with the emotional evolution that Riley's going through, but like puberty is way more than just like suddenly acknowledging that you have anxiety, right? Like it's like a whole other thing. And so
Yeah.
and not that I wanted that movie, like I wouldn't have wanted the like this is all about puberty version of this movie. While that could be helpful, like to schools and stuff like that, like as a moviegoer, I don't necessarily need that movie, right? You know what I mean? But yeah, I think there's some kind of disconnect with like it's trying to capture all of adolescence, everything involved in
Mm.
that, but at the same time, it's only 3 days, and it's so hyper focused. Like anxiety, we didn't mention this in not spoiler mode for a reason. Like anxiety is the main character of this movie, basically, right?
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. And my son pointed out like the first one didn't have a villain, so he really read anxiety as a villain. I think that's fair if you're 7 or 8, but then you realize like by the end the message is that anxiety has a role to play in our lives and so on. But yeah, definitely the main character of the movie like you're saying. A great performance by Maya Hawke.
yeah, and I think she really captures like yes, you can see her as the villain in that she literally stuffs all the other emotions in a jar, right? And is like, "Wahahaha," like, "Bye." But she doesn't have the "Mwahaha" moment, right? Like, she's
Mm,
so well-intentioned, and that's almost what makes her scarier, I think, is because she's trying to do good, right? And then ends up, like, it goes horribly wrong, and you're just kind of dreading the inevitability of, like, her being in control. Um, but I agree with you that I think in the end, they stuck the landing because, like, they aren't just like, "Oh, anxiety is bad," right? It's like, "Oh,
mm,
anxiety is in small quantities is a healthy, productive emotion and has a role to play." And that's actually what's brilliant about the first movies because they do the same thing with sadness, right? It's like
yeah.
the whole lesson that Joy learns is that you can't just push away and like stuff sadness into a jar, right? You have to embrace it. Sadness actually has a very healthy role in our emotional development, right? In that when we feel sad, because I think the line that they use is like sad being showing that you're sad is a way of asking for help, kind of. Right.
Mm.
That's what Riley, because it's only when they let Riley feel the sadness and then start crying in front of her parents that they can sort of try to figure out what's going on. Right. Or that she feels better after you. I think they do this with, or sadness comforts Bing Bong. And then Joy's like, "Whoa, like you just made him feel better by feeling sad. Like what is that about?"
Mm.
Um so counterintuitive to like we just think of, "Oh, you have to be happy all the time," right? So I think a similar thing is happening with anxiety where it's like, "Oh, it's good to sort of think about the consequences of something," right? That in general is a healthy self-preservation thing. But it's just when you let that when you obsess over that and you let that monopolize all of your decision making, is when it becomes unhealthy. And so I think they got there at the end, which I appreciated. And and now there's a good time to probably say when I asked my daughter, so what do you based on this movie, like what do you think anxiety is? And she gave actually a really smart answer, and it wasn't a negative answer. It's when you think about what could happen, and you're not, and but you don't
Mm.
know what's going to happen. And I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
that's actually really good." Like, um, and then I was the one that was like, "And when you worry about what's going to happen," right? That I was the one projecting, like, "Oh, well, you missed the part
Mm.
about where it's like really stressful and you're worrying about what's going to happen." But I think the way that the movie presents it is like, at if anxiety is a well balanced emotion with other emotions, that's what it's supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be the like, "Oh, what are the possible outcomes of this? How does that help me make a good decision?" Right?
Mhm. Well, and I think those opening interactions between joy and anxiety help demonstrate that, right? I'm not accusing your daughter of having fallen asleep halfway through, but like those early ones where it's like joy grabs the controls and does something goofy, and Riley suffers socially, kind of help demonstrate, like, yeah, you need to be a more sophisticated emotion, and anxiety is the one who can negotiate those nicely. Um, where then I think the other place to go in the why did this not quite get there as much as the first one is it really expands the mythology. It all feels so weird because it's a cartoon movie, but this mythology that the way this world worked previously is they formed memories and some of those memories became core memories. Now we have more levels, which is that some of these experiences are so important that they get taken in an elevator down and planted as beliefs. And when those beliefs grow, they become a sense of self. And kind of the core conflict is that Riley's sense of self that had blossomed up until puberty is replaced by one fueled by anxiety only. And that sense of self gets ruined. And so I'll pitch it to you, but I'll say, like, that basic level works, but that's the part where my 4-year-old's like, I don't understand any of this.
Right. Yeah. Like the little tree, right? The little like elegantly
Yeah.
constructed delicate tree that's supposed to be the self. Yeah, for me, and I mentioned this in my short take, like for me, that's where the movie starts to not to like waffle. Like it's not. I think it's
Mhm.
not as confident in those more like because the concepts get more abstract, right? Belief systems and the self, like those are huge concepts that philosophers still debate about today. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
so I think it was facing more of an uphill battle with those concepts. But what's interesting is like I don't know if this is a problem or just their solution to a problem, but like of it being too complex. But I think the simplification of the blue tree versus the red tree is
Mm.
like if you're actually trying to represent these concepts is too reductive. But I did like that Joy comes to the conclusion on her own that she has to also rip out the blue tree. That
Mhm.
like that like we can't preserve sort of like the childlike innocence, like that's unrealistic, that somehow we have to fuse we have to integrate the what the new emotions produce into a new sense of self, right? Or at least that was kind of my interpretation. I'm like, oh, because she they make a big deal. She's like, oh, I'm not just replacing it, putting the blue tree back. We can't go back, right?
Yep.
We have to grow a new one.
Well,
So
the core belief they use to demonstrate this topic is Riley's belief, I'm a good friend. And so that's like a core belief that becomes a part of her sense of self. And I think that's just a good example of exactly what you just said. Like you can't just be like, I'm a good friend, and that answers all questions. You have to
yeah,
think about what, as you become a teenager, you think, what does friendship mean? What does being a good friend entail? And all of those levels of it. And so I do think at a base level that works. And I guess since we're in spoiler mode, we'll say the final tree is like a real endorsement of the kind of malleable sense of self, that it almost like phases between different versions.
mm,
And I
mm-hmm,
think that's
mm-hmm.
a pretty good way within this convoluted mythology of representing what a sense of self is that, yes, I am the me that I am with my kids, and I'm the me that I am at work and with my wife and with my buddies. And when I sit alone in a room, yeah, I'm all those parts of myself, and it's just which part shows up. So yeah, I mean, and I think that's where I will kind of come down on this whole world, is they do a really nice job of like trying to get to some really hard concepts, and if they fall a little bit short, I end up being fine with that because they made the attempt, and trying
Right,
to
right, yes,
interpret that is so good. So yeah.
right. And again, like just even broaching those subjects with kids, I think is hugely valuable. Like even if for me the person pushing up my glasses being like, well, like like is that really how this works? Like I think yeah, even if it falls short, I think it's still doing a lot of good work. Um, so the other part in terms of like why is this falling short is like we have this whole section of the movie where they go to this vault of secrets and we meet this whole little cast of characters. There's Bluefy, uh, who's like to me was like a weird combination of like Blue's Clues, um, Bluey, right? Because I feel like you can't have a character named Bluefy without being like, oh, it's like Bluey because it's a dog, and like for me, I don't know if you caught this because my kids when they're really really little used to watch a lot of the show called Mickey Mouse's Clubhouse.
Same.
And I
That's
was
where
like, "Oh,
my
this
head
is
went.
coming after Mickey Mouse Clubhouse." Like just the way that and Pouchy in particular.
Pouchy. Yeah.
Yeah, because Toodles I think is the equivalent on Mickey
Yep.
Mouse Clubhouse, but they it's the same intonation where they're like, "Oh, Toodles," right? And here they're like, "Oh, Pouchy." And Pouchy shows up and is like, "Here are four random objects. Which of these things do you think you need?" It's supposed to get kids to try to figure out problem solving. I was laughing my head off during this whole
Yep.
section. But then I was like, why is this in this movie? Like I don't understand. It
Yeah.
seems like a really
Well,
huge digression. I don't know, what do you think?
that is 100% where I was laughing the hardest too. They have this gag because I think this is clearly aimed at the parent audiences who have sat through these shows 1,000 times. And my kids were also Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. And like, on that show, the objects, you're not quite sure what to choose, but it's pretty clear. This one, it's like a rubber duck, a stick, dynamite. It's comedically overdrawn. And then the where I really lost it was when they asked who Bluefy was talking to, you, and he was standing facing the wall saying like,
Yes.
and what should I pick? What do you think I should do? Talking to the wall. I was dying because I've sat through so many of those. Uh, we've said a lot of nice things about Pixar, so I'm going to say, to answer your question, why is this here? This is here because Spider-Verse and Lord and Mitchell have taken a lot of the cake out of Pixar's mouths, right? And so Bluefy is 2D animated, and there's another character whose name I'm not going to remember, who's a video game character and appears as a video game,
Is
polyhedral
Lance
rendered
something?
shape. Lance sounds right. And
I'll look it
so
up while you're talking.
as soon as those wandered on screen, and it is a short time, I actually expected they were going to be along for the adventure when they first showed up. I was like, oh, you're really jealous of Sony animation right now and what they've been able to do. And neither is rendered with the love and care that, say, a Spider-Punk was, where they, changed him every frame and so on. But it did feel like their attempt to say, oh, animation has moved beyond our kind of Pixar style. And, anybody at Sony Animation would say they were standing on the shoulders of Pixar. And this felt like Pixar being like, oh, but we want to be with the cool kids too. And it felt a little sweaty to me, if I'm being honest.
So it's Lance Slashblade, who's hilarious because he's animated slightly more pixelated, like as if he were from a Final Fantasy game from like 10 years ago. And basically, like, when he starts walking, he's trying to walk out the door, but then because he's being controlled like a video game character, he keeps bumping, and then you have to slightly turn and then keep going. That to me felt so real as someone who played video games that do that. And it was so funny, but I was like, this is not helping the story at all. And so the other thing too, conceptually, is like, because I think all these characters are here, right? They tell us because there are things that Riley still holds onto from her childhood, but she's too embarrassed to admit, right? Bluefy is like a preschool. She's clearly aged out of watching that show, but she still really likes it. The video game character she had a crush on when and doesn't, like, is embarrassed about that, right? But the thing is, like, the movie doesn't. First of all, the movie's not about that. There's nothing in this movie, and I would actually categorize the June Squibb nostalgia bit as being part of this too. This movie's not about childhood nostalgia, right? Like, it's not about letting go, like or as a teenager, like, that could be a whole other movie, is like being a teenager who's like embarrassed by the things you loved as a kid and then rediscovering that it's okay to still like those things, right? That's a whole other movie. And not this movie, right? The plot about anxiety and ambition and making friends and social anxiety and stuff like that, like, has nothing to do with all the stuff that this little secret vault, and we never find out what the dark secret is.
No,
which I was super annoyed by.
That has to be a deep tease for Inside Out 3, right? Like, that's all I could think when they left it in the vault. But I'm gonna try to defend it, even though my emotions are largely with you. So one thing that comes to mind is one of my favorite authors, because I'm a guy who grew up in New Hampshire, is John Irving. And I think it's in Prayer for Owen Meany, but it might actually be in the Cider House Rules. He says adolescence is when we start to keep secrets. And that's what kind of marks the beginning of that, right? Is that we start to have a version of ourselves we keep secret from everybody else. And that kind of defines adulthood. And so I think there's something to that. There's a purity. Bluefy gives Riley like pure joy. So on a meta level, as we're locking up joy and hiding that, that's also where these kind of deep secrets would belong. And a video game crush would be locked down there before you know how to experience embarrassment, right? So if we're taking this, like, embarrassment arrived, then, you wouldn't know how to express that. So you would just kind of shut those feelings down. We're oversharing. So I will say, when I was little, I always think my first television crush was Penny from Inspector Gadget. And, like, I didn't realize she was a cartoon. Like, that, my brain didn't work there. And I couldn't have articulated that was a crush because I didn't have that vocabulary. But I felt an attachment. And so I kind of read Riley's video game crushes that way. Like, I'm getting feelings I don't know what to call or how to deal with. So let's just cram those down. Let's lock those in the vault. I will only also redeem this segment by saying it did feature the return of Frank Oz and Dave Goelz, the two Muppeteers who had a cameo in the first Inside Out, and I still don't know why. I actually didn't know this till last year. Frank Oz was really high on my Letterboxd status, and I was like, what is the 8th movie? And I was like, Inside Out? Like, I totally didn't clock that, but they had a good bit in the first one where they are accusing each other of stealing each other's hats, and it says "my hat" inside, and so they show that here. So it's a little bit of a callback in a movie not kind of interested in sequel callbacks. So
Mm.
it was a fun little sequence, but it felt like all it was doing was setting up the return of Pouchy later. Although I'm not even sure that part of that plot line totally made sense to me either. But
I mean, yeah, that felt more like a gag than anything else because it's like
yeah.
Anger gets attached to Pouchy and is like, I have a fanny pack now. Pouchy, like, I mean, I would watch like a short about Pouchy. You know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
like because Pouchy is at the same time, and I wrote this in our doc, like nightmare fuel, but also like your new best friend. Like and almost seems like something out of like I don't want to say like a South Park episode, but like it feels like something that's purely there for parody. Um
Mhm.
and again, like tonally inconsistent with the rest of this movie, I think. But I'm torn because I liked it. Like I had fun watching
Yeah.
Pouchy. Um and like and
Well,
Anger stuffing his arm down Pouchy's throat and him being like, oh, like he's like, don't you have anything useful in here? Right. And I'm just like, this is like kind of inappropriate and not consistent with the rest of this movie, but I'm here for it, I guess.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a side of this that feels like the story creators and animators are just parents and they're trying to kind
Mm.
of encapsulate the parent experience. And so I think that's what we're saying. We liked these gags because we've sat through, 200 hours of these shows. I wonder, if PT were brave enough to be on this episode. That's not true. He just was busy and couldn't see the movie. But if he were brave enough to see a cartoon movie, I wonder if he would have cared as much about that gag. I think breaking the fourth wall gags are a little kind of hacky at this point, so it might not land if for somebody who hasn't seen these. So it's kind of a curious bit. I guess another major segment we haven't talked too much about, so I'll throw it to you with like the return to Imagination Land seems to be kind of
Mm.
built around the idea that as you become a teenager, your imagination gets, I guess in this case, literally deconstructed and it kind of disappears. How did that sequence work for you? Did you like it or was it too on the nose?
I mean, if I remember correctly, they had sort of already started to do that with the first movie, right? Or there was something
Yeah,
weird, like I think it's for a different reason, right? It's because they lost the core memories and everything's falling apart. But that part
right.
felt a little repetitious to me, to be honest. And again, because it's not about the loss of innocence, I don't think that's the main agenda of this movie is to talk about the loss of innocence when you become a teenager. It's more about the anxiety and these new things that you have to suddenly deal with. It seemed to not fit. I would classify that with Pouchy as like, I thought it was fun to watch, but not necessarily consistent with the rest of the movie or didn't fit with the movie. Um, but I actually think that like all the, I think it's to me, it felt like one of those things they had to come up with and had to include because of the plot, not because of the story, right? It's because,
Mm,
oh, the classic emotions from the first movie, they have to go on this journey to try to rescue, uh, the blue tree, like the Riley's old sense of self from the back of her mind. And because of that, they have to go on this sort of quest where they go through all these different lands, all these different parts of her mind, right? But it felt like that was purely because they had to and not because it like added anything to the main story that they were trying to tell. um Whereas I feel like the new emotions, this is me attempting to segue into another question, the new emotions that they introduce, anxiety, envy, ennui, and embarrassment, that I think worked much better in terms of like, oh,
mm.
because I think that's what the movie is actually trying to be about, is like, okay, introducing these new emotions and sort of figuring out what their role is and how they're going to be integrated into and play nicely with the old ones. um so I want to ask you, like, what did you feel about those new four emotions? Did you feel like some of them work better than others? Did you have a favorite?
Yeah, I think what you're articulating here is that this movie sets its priority at explaining puberty to those that are about to go through it, much more than talking to adults about what it's like to go through it. And I think the new emotions play into that really nicely. You know, they're kind of one beat, but the beat generally works. I already praised Maya Hawke as anxiety, and the idea that all your attention can and to build off the imagination land question, all of imagination land has turned into a weird kind of an animation studio, like where they're cracking the gun to
Oh
like use
yeah.
all your
Mhm.
imagination to think about what's going to go wrong. And yet that is what it feels like. I experience this with my son a lot. I experience it with myself, where you sit at home and you're like, oh, if I go do this thing, this could go wrong and that could go wrong and this could go wrong. And then you're like, just go try. And if something goes wrong, deal with it then, or what have you. So I thought that worked out really well. I think we're both letterbox best friends with Ao Edibiri, who's here as Envy. And I would say for me, that one kind of got lost in the mix. I don't think there was a lot for Envy to do. I like the idea of, as you become a teenager, envy grows within you. And she's kind of little, but I could imagine her taking over. Maybe she's the villain of Pixar 3. Uh, and so that works. Probably my favorite single gag of the new emotions is embarrassment arriving and going for a high five and switching to a fist bump and then having a sweaty hand. Like, just
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right exactly in the feels of what I am like in every social situation. And then I feel like all I'm doing is listing them, but Ennui being teenage, I like that they leaned into calling her Ennui and then softened it with the boredom, but it plays right into the students I teach, where they all have that kind of, I'm just going to dabble on my phone and not be engaged because I'm bored even before I've started class. So I do think all of those represent kind of teenagedom well, even if they don't always totally pop in this. I'll throw it back to you with your thoughts on those emotions and add the question of, in the plot of the movie, embarrassment and sadness kind of team up. And I wondered if you had thoughts on why that was, and what you made of that kind of choice to connect those two.
Yeah, and I actually really like that.
Mm.
And I think it's happening because they in each set of emotions, they are the ones that are sort of ostracized a little bit or like seen as uncool. Because
Mm.
sadness is like Joy keep in the first movie, Joy keeps trying to be like, all right, sadness, just she draws the tiny little circle and is like, just stay in the circle. Like that's your only job is to stay in the circle. And she really likes reading all the manuals and stuff like that. Like she's
Mm.
characterized as the one who's not cool, and the other emotions don't really know what to do with her or how to interact with her. And embarrassment seems like this the equivalent in this new group where like they're like, oh yeah, that's just embarrassment. He's kind of weird, and doesn't do anything, and then actually ends up doing something, right? So, um, I think I think that's why they're being paired together, and I actually really like that. I actually kind of wanted more of that. I feel like
Mm.
at the end of the day, sadness just ended up sort of like huddling in a corner for a while and then like being like, "Psst, hey, embarrassment." And I was like, ooh, I want to see where this goes. And it didn't quite go far enough, I feel like,
Mm.
for it to be satisfying. But I did like their interactions, and I thought that made sense that they would like be on the same wavelength because they're like the uncool ones in the group or something. But in terms of, I want to co-sign the envy being underused.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I got really excited when I found out Io Adebri is going to be in this movie, and then I was like, oh, like she was good, but she actually didn't really have a lot to do. She's more kind of second fiddle to anxiety and is just kind of like
Yeah.
chiming in every once in a while. She doesn't actually have her own arc that she goes on, and I feel like that's just a missed opportunity because I do feel like there in the story that they gave us with the hockey camp, there was a lot of potential to talk about envy and to be like,
Mm.
oh, why do you want the things that other people have, and what's problematic about that and stuff like. And they just didn't really do anything with it. Um, so that's kind of what I think about that. But at the same time, like, do I want to trade a bunch of scenes that anxiety has, which I do agree that Maya Hawke is doing really, really great work again because she sounds so kind of innocuous, but then she has that kind of twitchy fast talky kind of like nervous energy that works really, really well for the character. That's not necessarily like negative overtly, but is kind of like just makes you kind of like like it makes you kind of jumpy to be like, oh gosh, like she's going, she's really going. So yeah, I would say yeah. So I'm mixed about it because I feel like I don't know if there was room necessarily to develop the other characters. I thought Ennui was just hilarious, and like
Yeah.
I really like the idea that Ennui only perks up and like opens her eyes when her phone is gone.
Yeah.
Like to me, that was such a great way to sort of sneak in commentary about like screen culture and stuff like that I really enjoyed. So yeah, in general, I'd say that this new set worked really well. With maybe the exception of Envy. Like, I just wanted more Envy. Writing is not there to support a good Io Edebiri performance.
Yeah, and we know, I mean, this podcast is nothing if not a fan podcast for Ao Edebiri. And you know, the way she owned Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and obviously the Bear, but also Theater Camp and Bottoms, you know, she could have done more, but I think you're right. It seems like, you know, there could be a version of the screenplay where that was a much bigger part and then they had to trim it back and focused it a little bit more.
Right. Especially with the hair
On
thing. The hair dyeing thing. I
yeah,
feel like that could have
yeah,
been a
and
good
then
place to
hockey
have Envy get
skills,
involved.
right?
Yes.
Like, oh, they could do that easily. Oh, she can skate like that. She can make that goal. It could have easily been a part of that. And because she's so little and cutesy, it really made me wonder if there would be a moment where she like turned into a monster and roared and
Oh,
rampaged
yeah,
or
yeah.
something. Kind of like Puss in Boots does in some ways. Just because I want to work a tangent that you can cut out, I will say Ennui's gag about the phone reminded me for a long time at my last job, I had to track down kids and they had to just hand me a form. And I'd given this kid the form like 10 times. And he was finally like, I'll see if I can get to it. And I was finally like, all you have to do is sign that piece of paper and just walk it into my door. I will stand up from my desk and come grab it from your hand. And so after weeks and weeks, months and months of this, he finally rolled in on a hoverboard. And I was like, you couldn't even walk into my office. That was too much. So it really always, that emotion stands out to me as so true for adolescents
Right.
in a
Yeah.
funny way. Yeah, I just we aren't the rewatchables, but I'll pitch a double feature. I want to see. I want to put Asteroid City up against this one because you can get Maya Hawke being the like most calming, soothing presence, and then switch over to her being the most anxiety-inducing one, which just shows her range. And I think there's no shortage of Maya Hawke projects in the future. I think she's got a long career ahead of her, which I go back and forth whether she reminds me more of her mom or her dad. But it's either. It's both, and she's doing her own thing, so that's pretty great. Sorry to endorse nepo babies.
That's quite all right. Yeah, it's easy. It's hard. It's crazy to think about that she's also on Stranger Things. Like I keep being like, oh right, Maya Hawke's also in this. Like she's on Stranger Things now, and like yeah, she does a bunch of stuff that's really cool. So yeah, very exciting. Yeah, maybe we need to add her to the Dune Part 2 new movie star generation group. I would
Yeah,
put her in
I
there
think that
with
would fit.
yeah. All right. I think we're ready to move into the rhetorical situation. We got a couple things we could talk about in there that I think we're sort of naturally working our way towards. So the rhetorical situation, a segment in which we look at a film through the lens of our academic experience. So all four of our regular co-hosts are writing professors, so we like to have the section dedicated to making connections to our experience as scholars and teachers. In the teaching of writing, the rhetorical situation refers to any contextual factors, and I'm mentioning this because I think this is what we're going to focus on right now, that influence composing and interpretation. To me, the big one that we've danced around but we haven't totally talked about is the state of Pixar and kind of discourse surrounding Pixar as a studio. And so, like, how do you feel like that is impacting the way people are going to receive this movie?
It's so tough right now. I think I think we've alluded to the fact we're both big Pixar fans. We haven't alluded to the fact when we were hanging out and friends in person before becoming internet friends, you used to visit Pixar a lot. So you've been to their campus multiple times and seen some of that. So maybe you should disclaim that before. No, I'm just kidding. So I do think that Pixar has struggled in recent years. Some of that criticism is fair, some of that is unfair. I will say it is not fair when you talk about Elemental. It is incredibly fair when you talk about Lightyear. Just a totally misconceived, nonsensical, couldn't even get my, at the time, 7-year-old son engaged with it, even though he would have been the core audience for it. Just total creative misfire as a part of that. So I think I think people fall mostly where we are, which is that despite their sins, we are really kind of rooting for Pixar. That's where I am, right? It's like I want them to be good, and I want their movies to have that kind of special place that they really did for so many years. And all of this comes from, like, they just had hit after hit after hit. They didn't miss, and even when they wobbled, it was still, Wall-E, I think, is not the biggest commercial success, but a lot of people are like, yeah, that's so interesting and so creative and so on. So I think it's definitely coloring people's thirst to go back for a good Pixar movie and hope that this one will be there, and those nostalgia glasses on Inside Out, because it doesn't look like Lightyear in hindsight, right? It looks really good. So I think that's all fueling that. Here's my concern now, and I'll pitch it back to you with this. So box office wise, Pixar got its mojo back. We just had a really big opening. Nothing Disney released in the calendar year 2023 had as big an opening as this movie did. And I think it's now second only to one Pixar movie in terms of biggest opening animated weekend of all time. You had said this in the opening. It beat Mario, which was a surprise, I think, for some people.
That's what really blew my mind. I was like, oh, this is serious now.
Yeah. So do you think this means we're only going to get fed a diet of Pixar sequels now, or are they still going to try to do new and original stuff?
I mean, I hope not, but that's probably likely, because if this did well, like, wouldn't it be the most Hollywood thing for them to misinterpret why it's doing well, and like, oh, that means that people just want the old stuff, right? And they're like, no, were you not paying attention to the nostalgia joke that throughout this movie? We keep wanting nostalgia to go back. Where it's too soon. It's too soon, right? But I think so. To me, the arc of Pixar, in terms of sort of how it was at its heights and sort of now why it's not quite at its peak, right? It's had a downturn. To me, is because of what we talked about in actually the opening of this episode, where the idea of, can you strike that perfect balance of being for parents and for kids? And I think that the best Pixar movies hit that right down the middle, where it's like, and simultaneously. So earlier when I was complaining about, like, I thought the pouchy stuff and the video game character and the whatever, like that whole digression, I thought it was really funny, but at no point was there also like a version of that for kids. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't operating on those two levels. It was like, okay, let's stop and turn to the parents and be like, hey, do you remember all these like video games you played when you were a kid, or all these like kids shows that you've been forced to watch, right? Like, and then it's like, okay, now back to the kids movie, right? Whereas I think the best Pixar movies at its height, Toy Story, all the ones we mentioned earlier, Toy Story, Ratatouille, it has that simultaneity to it of like, it is at once for kids and for adults. There are two levels at which you can appreciate it and understand it. And then I think there's a point at which, probably right after the first Inside Out movie, where I think they, again, misinterpreting the success. I think after the big success of the first Inside Out movie, the assumption was, okay, people want more high concept movies, right? Because all the ones that came after that, I'm thinking in particular of Soul, a movie that I really enjoyed but have never watched again.
Yeah.
Which I think says everything. That the movies kept kind of getting more and more abstract, higher and higher concept, and it became too convoluted for kids to actually enjoy. And then that's how we end up with Lightyear, a movie that has a cat in space and somehow is not fun. Like, right?
A
robot cat in space, I should say.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the arc, is like they just kind of kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and then lost what made them the formula work so well to begin with. And I hesitate to use the word formula even, but like, that idea of like it no longer became equally appealing to kids and adults. It became more for just adults. And I think this movie, is going to be more successful because it's starting to, regress in a very neutral way. It's starting to go back to that original balance of like, it doesn't have
Yeah.
to, yes, it is a little bit high concept, but we're not going to think too hard about the high concept. And there's going to be a lot of fun stuff in here for kids as well. And I think it's not quite there, but I think it's a step in that right direction. Whether or not we're going to keep trending that way, I have no idea. It's like,
Yeah. I think that's very well said, and I agree with that. And I think we mentioned among ours, Toy Story 2 with the Jessie the Cowgirl sequence was like the original Pixar can really destroy you. And then for me, Toy Story 3, the little toys gripping each other's hands as they're about to die. I'm crying just thinking of it because it's so beautifully done and does work on those two levels. Like my kids watch that and they understand like the toys are about to die. Like this is going to be terrible.
right. They're
Whereas
endangered.
I'm
Yeah.
like, all they can do is just hold their hands and that's what they're going to do with their life. It's yeah. And so then those two up and then the up opening 10 minutes, it started this brand of like Pixar will go to Pixar to cry your eyes out. And I think then they felt like they had to match that. And so one of the ones that has somehow gone unnamed so far is Onward, which I think a lot of people missed because it was, for me personally, it was literally the last movie I saw before the pandemic. My
But it
son and
was
I
for
had
more people the
tickets.
straight to Disney Plus, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because my son and I saw it on one side of a theater, and I was nervous that there was another family who had pre-bought the tickets on the entire opposite side of the theater. And it's like, well, what could happen? We don't know. So then it got an extended fast release onto Disney Plus, and like Marvel and like Star Wars, I think we found that Disney Plus ended up doing a lot more damage to these brands because the product got pumped out really quickly and without that
Mm-hmm.
kind of special, check. I think Marvel's the worst offender on that, but it feels like a little bit of Pixar got damaged in that. And then you add the complication of then there's now Disney animated studios, which it's not always clear which ones are Pixar and which ones are Disney. We talked so much about how this is a puberty movie, and I wanted to remind us, like, yeah, and Disney Animation did a puberty movie. It's called Turning Red, and it was really well done and
Yes.
really thoughtful about puberty and a lot more of these dimensions than this one is. They're actually interested in very different parts of adolescence. So I think all of that really hurt the brand, and I hate to say that you're right with the regression, and I hope that can mean not just sequels, mix in a few originals. And I believe the upcoming slate has, there's a Toy Story 5 coming, and I think there is one or two original ideas in the mix as well. So, but we'll see, right? Because you know what these movie studios really need right now? Money. And this is a proven formula.
Yeah, it's hard to tell because opening weekend, if those numbers are really high, that does mean people are like, oh, I know that IP.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like,
Yes.
there is probably some truth to like sequels get people to go to the theaters because they get excited, they recognize it. People are much less likely to go to the theater for something they don't know now. And I think that's the problem, is like studios are much less likely to take a chance on something because they know people are only going to go out to the theater for something that either is a sort of tentpole event spectacle or something that they are like, oh, I really love the original version of that, so I want to go check out the next one. And so, and this is tough. It's a tough place to be. So yeah, I think the logical follow up to this to really bring Pixar back in full, because I think it's way too soon to say like Pixar's back. Like, you know what I mean? Even if the box office is amazing. But I think that if the next movie they follow up with is an original and is one that kind of does more of that, it's for kids as much as it is for adults, then I would be a lot more optimistic. But I think if they follow this up with Toy Story 5, it's kind of like, well, like we really did end Toy Story with Toy Story 4. Like Toy Story 4 really closed out the, like, I don't know what Toy Story 5 would be about. It's not about Woody. We finished Woody's storyline, right? So like Is it like a Duke Kaboom movie? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, I wouldn't say no to that. I guess I thought he was very funny, but so it's interesting to see where they will go from here, and if this changes their course at all, in terms of like, oh, well, this movie did really well. What does that tell us, right?
Mm.
So yeah, we'll also just have to see, like, the reviews for this movie have not been bad. So that would indicate
No.
to me that opening weekend is just the beginning of a big box office haul, as opposed to, like, the reverse almost happened with Elemental. Again, more abstraction. Like, the main
Yeah.
problem I had with Elemental, I was just like, this is not actually about elements. Like, why are these characters elements? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
It's almost the abstraction for the sake of it, kind of. And I was like, we really got off the rails here. Even though, like, there are parts of that movie I really liked. But so my point was a box office one. Elemental got terrible reviews, didn't really do well opening weekend, but like you said earlier, chugged along all summer. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see where we are with Inside Out 2 by the end of the summer and what that means.
And if people are keeping track of their summer movie box office wager, the problem with Inside Out performing exactly like Elemental is we have some Minions arriving in 2 or 3 more weeks
That's right.
as we drop this episode. I can't speak for all parents. I would pay good money to see Inside Out 200 times and never have to go see the Minions. But, boomer Facebook suggests those Minions are connecting with people in a different way as well. So I don't think everybody feels the way I do. Just because I did some productive Googling while you were speaking, if you go to Pixar's official website, the next project they have announced is Elio, coming out next June, which is being billed as an original sci-fi story. The internet at large says Toy Story 5 is coming, but it's not actually featured on their website. So it may just be early stages of development, or they're waiting to get a really good script before they kind of put a push behind it. So, the old-fashioned one for them, one for me model can also work with, sequel versus non-sequel. And I think, it is amazing how many are not touched. WALL-E, Ratatouille, Up. Some of those have had kind of TV show spinoffs, but they're up there. Pixar was out there very harshly this weekend, saying they are not interested in doing live action remakes of their movies. I don't even know what that would look like for many of them. Some of them you could see, but yeah.
Well, so that was that was a response to Josh O'Connor being like, I would love to play the main character in a Ratatouille live action. Which, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not saying no to that, because that seems like great casting. If we're gonna, I mean, I don't think any of the Disney live action remakes have been successful. Like, no. I don't get why we keep. I mean, I get why we keep making them. I don't think there's a reason to keep making them. They don't work in general. So I don't want that to happen with Pixar. But if we're being forced to do it, I feel like Josh O'Connor as Linguini, something like that. Greg's
that's not on my Mount Rushmore. I even missed the Ratatouille ride at Epcot last year, which I've been told is a major, major mistake. But I had a fussy kid and an impending thunderstorm, so we did Guardians of the Galaxy and left Epcot. I'll get back someday.
Oh,
please, Disney.
Well, we don't have that right here at all. So, Alfredo Linguini is because they call him Linguini in the movie. The other contextual thing we didn't really factor in, and this is mostly because I don't really want to talk about it, but we have to keep in mind too that, like, this arc that we're describing does coincide with a lot of changes to the leadership of Pixar as a studio. Yep. And you mentioned them getting bought by Disney or whatever, or merging with Disney, but like, John Lasseter, right, got fired for inappropriate behavior.
Me Too reasons.
So, like,
yeah,
I think that's part of they're still trying to find their footing post all of that turmoil. So,
well, and I think Disney purchases give a lot of financial comfort to these studios, but it's been tricky for all of them to negotiate that. Even our beloved Star Wars maybe has its feet under it right now, but hasn't released a movie in 5 years, which is kind of crazy. So it's interesting to see that the kind of corporate negotiations, and I already name checked the Disney Plus moment as a part of that. I think, in hindsight, that's now seen as a pretty major mishandling of how that should have been rolled out or how that worked. But we'll see how they all go moving forward. In sometimes, in spite of myself, root for all of these Disney underlings and find myself being like, I'm a Pixar guy, I'm a Marvel guy, I'm a Star Wars guy, despite being like, am I a Disney guy? I don't feel like a Disney adult. But it's like, there comes a certain point where you just have to admit they know how to handle IP and so on. Um, Captain America Happy Meal toys spoiling the movie a year ahead of time, notwithstanding,
Yeah,
perhaps.
hopefully,
But
maybe their
generally,
strategy was people hoping, maybe they were hoping people would forget about the spoilers by the time the movie actually comes out. But yeah,
so
it's rough.
bizarre.
I don't understand. Something about their contract with McDonald's must have made it
It's going
so that they
wrong.
were forced to put those toys out. Yeah, because I feel like I wouldn't think that they would want to do that. For sure.
Yeah.
Um, so the last thing I want to ask you before we move into Oscars watch is you had a great idea about how sort of this idea of pop psychology fits into this film, and like what is this film actually doing for our emotional intelligence as a society, kind of. I think is maybe the question. But yeah,
Yeah.
what
Yeah, so Jen is being very kind. I put like a total like word vomit of like ideas in there, and it is a hard idea to articulate. But I'll say it like this. I'm going to take a shot at the Trolls franchise again, but I believe the first Trolls movie came out about the same time as Inside Out, and Inside Out was such a nuanced, kind of developed take at what emotional health looks like in childhood. And then Trolls came out and was like, but you can just be happy. Like, choose to be happy. Yay, happy. And I think they got a lot of kind of flack for that at the time. And then Trolls has gone out to pump out three more while we've kind of stalled on some of the Pixar movies. But I would frame it like this. Like, this kind of children's entertainment does not have to take emotions so seriously and does not have to be so thoughtful about teaching kids how to be themselves. And so I guess my question to you is like, do you think this is good work to be trying to do? Is it kind of beyond what these movies should be attempting? Because in my mind, if they do a bad job at it, it's going to do real damage. Whereas I think, they've been largely successful in dealing with this. So do you think the pop psychology of this, the way in which it tries to help teach kids about emotion is a smart move, is a good move? And would you watch Inside Out 3 kind of knowing they're going to play with those same ideas?
in general I'd say yes, and I think that's because I think about my own teaching, and I'm constantly trying to take something that seems really lofty and abstract and sort of like, oh, I'm not smart enough to understand that, and really try like I've had a good teaching day when I've taken something like that and made it really concrete and accessible. And I think that's what the brilliance of these Out movies are, is that, like, I mentioned earlier, asked my daughter what she thought anxiety was. I would never have done that, probably. I'm
Mm.
not that great a parent. Like, I would never have done that if were it not for us seeing this movie and be having the occasion to talk to her about that, right? Again, maybe there's an exigency here, to use another rhetorical term of like, because we had seen this movie, I was like, hey, let's talk about emotions, right? Like, let's
Mm.
like do a nice follow-up discussion to this movie. It wasn't like a particularly deep discussion necessarily, but I'm glad that we had it, right? Because it opened up the idea that it's just the fact that it's okay to identify and discuss the nature of your feelings. And I guess in parenting in general, I think there's been a big swing towards this of right of like, the best way to talk to a child who's having a meltdown is like to acknowledge their feelings first, right? To be like, I
Yes.
can see that you are upset about X, right? As opposed to being like, don't be upset, don't stop crying, right? Like
Mm.
what,
Mm.
like, so I think there's a big way in which this movie can do a lot of heavy lifting. And that's why I was kind of sad the parents weren't in the first one, because I think that's what makes the first movie so useful, because it's like almost, it's helping kids understand their emotions, but also teaching parents how to talk to kids about their emotions, in a way that's really useful. And so I think that, like, for me in this movie, it really flagged for me, oh, you're going to have to start talking about self-esteem and confidence, and like when you are not good at something, how to deal with that. So, and like, I'm always thinking about the one line in this where she's starts saying, echoing to herself, I'm not good enough. And that
Mm.
was like so heartbreaking, because I feel like, I've had moments throughout my whole life of feeling like I'm not good enough. and how like, and only through much like maturing and age and time do you start to understand, oh, that's just your mind kind of messing with you. That's not actually true. Just because you feel that way doesn't make it true. And so I feel like this movie really opened up that for me to be like, oh, this is something you have to teach your kids, right? You can't, you shouldn't let them spend 30 years trying to figure that out on their own, right? Like they can talk about it now. And so I think from that perspective, I think these movies are doing really great work. That said, I do agree with you that if handled poorly, and I don't think they've been handled poorly so far, right? Even despite my criticism earlier about like talking about belief systems in the self, like it's a little squirrely. But, you know, I think if they stick to what they've been doing so far in terms of being like, all emotions are healthy, we don't repress emotions, right? All emotions that we have a purpose, but we just can't let one overtake the others. Like, as long as that is generally the core messaging, I think we're going to be okay. And I think these movies should keep going. That said, I don't know what if we age up Riley more, like what happens? Like she goes to college and then we have to talk, and then maybe really we have to face this question of like the self and like, who are you? And, you know, who are your, I don't know. Yeah. So like, I don't know. Yeah. I think they're going to run out of runway eventually, but in general, I think these movies are helpful.
Riley's quarter life crisis. It feels like even like after college, like being lost or something. Yeah, and I think part of why I wanted to ask the question is just to note that they don't have to do this. You know, there are very successful, and I'm not going to take another shot at Trolls, but there are very, very successful kids movies that make a ton of money that don't attempt to do anything meaningful, right? Right now on Disney Plus, they finally debuted the Jim Henson documentary, and one of the things the Jim Henson documentary is called The Idea Man. It's a new Ron Howard film. It's just a straight bio documentary of Jim Henson. But one of the things it reminded me of was the genesis of Sesame Street, and where Sesame Street came from is the founders behind the Children's Television Workshop were like disgusted by how many hours of TV kids were watching and how much of that was purely commercials, and was like, they're watching that because it's bright colors and flashing lights. What if we take that format and instead use it to teach numbers, right? Use it to teach letters. And that's where it came from. And 50 years later is still a beloved part of childhood and done, you know, God's work of teaching our kids math, literacy, but also emotions, as we're talking about. And, you know, the age that we became parents, I'm sure Daniel Tiger factors large in the emotional health of your kids. And some of your comments, you know, merged onto the kind of millennial parent emotional health discourse, which my parents would immediately be like, you're teaching your kids, you know, to be wusses. That's not who my parents are, but that's who their generation is. And like, we're too in touch with our feelings. We don't care about what the kids are feeling. But I do think that these films are participating and doing really good work in that way. I did want to shout out my wife works for a publisher, and one of the big pushes they received was there's a child psychologist named Lisa Daymore who writes about anxiety, and she was an actual consultant on this film. So this film went out and talked to child psychologists and experts on these emotions and was able to kind of you know, make it meaningful and make sure they didn't misstep. And that's why, you know, my question to you earlier about why did embarrassment talk to sadness, I actually cheated off my son because my son asked me that. And so whereas like that feels like it could just be two characters, they've worked this to the depth where you're like, oh, I feel like that's meaningful, right? Like the highly abstracted allegorical level of this film, every little bit seems to matter a little bit for that. And I give them a lot of credit for that because, you know, my kids will, Netflix is my villain in this category. They just put any crap on the streaming service. You can't tell the quality whatsoever. Somebody joked on a podcast one time, it's like cartoons barely translated from other languages. And it's like, yeah, there's just nothing substantive there. And it's not trying to teach anything. But I think this movie deserves a lot of credit. And maybe why it should be in conversation for some Oscars might be because they put in that care towards that and some thought towards it.
Nicely done. So yeah, we're going to shift into Oscars watch. So the original Inside Out Sorry, the music's louder than it normally is, so I'm like, maybe I shouldn't talk over it. The original Inside Out got 2 nominations, so which I was one more than I remembered. So it was nominated and won animated feature, but it also got an original screenplay nomination, which I didn't remember and I was sort of surprised by. That's pretty good for an animated film. That exceeds like the norm, I think, because it's getting something outside of the animated feature category. Do you feel like this movie has a shot at all at something like that?
Yeah, I think in our discussion of when because PT's not here, so we had to do the Oscar Googling, and it was immediately like, well, the second one must be score. And I think,
Mhm.
that's kind of the natural place. So I think we were both surprised to see Best Original Screenplay. It did lose to Spotlight, but I mean, the category that year was Bridge of Spies, which people may forget was written by the Coen brothers, Ex Machina, Straight Outta Compton, Spotlight, and Inside Out. Um, that's a pretty tough category to be in, and says a lot that Inside Out grabbed that spot. I would say, boy, am I worried for it come Oscar Fairy. I feel like that's going to be something. Somebody's going to push that out. Although maybe Straight Outta Compton will catch the flack there. We'll have to see what that episode holds. Um, I think it doesn't have a chance at score this time around. I noted in the credits it's a new composer, and credit is given to Michael Giacchino for the original Inside Out scores. And I feel like a lot of the big emotional beats just play on those original themes more than do something new. Um, I think it's not gonna be squeaking in for best original screenplay because it would be best adapted now because sequels automatically go there, and it just feels like that's not going to be what they're interested in. But we'll see what the rest of the year holds. It is a terrible year for movies. If it is nominated for best adapted screenplay, it will probably lose it to Dune 2, I would imagine.
Oh, I hadn't even
What
thought
do you
about
think?
that. Yeah, for me, I'm at. I think if it's anything, it's just animated feature, and it really depends on how the rest of the year shakes out in terms of what its competition is. Because I think in recent years, the sort of saved spot for a Disney or Pixar movie, whichever one is the big one that year, I think is no longer a thing. It's not a safe bet anymore. I do think if people are positive on this and are like, this is sort of a return to form, that can definitely bring it back into that slot and be kind of like, well, it wasn't as good as the original, but like, we want to support you, Pixar. Welcome back. Like, if that's the narrative, then I can sort of see it getting a spot. But otherwise, it really depends on what else is in here. I'm looking at you, Wild Robot. Um,
That's a good call.
I think that gets in. Um, and I think that has a lot of the same kind of pulling heartstrings that classic Pixar movies does potentially, while also having the artsiness of like a Miyazaki movie. And so like
Yeah.
that one might edge it out, I think, and potentially like make it so there's no room. But it also depends on the PT's hype draft pick of the Lord of the Rings
Mm.
anime, right? If that blows people away, that's probably getting a spot. What else is going to be in animated feature? I'm trying to think. Like what's
Garfield and Minions, perhaps, but I don't see Despicable Me 4 pushing Inside Out 2 out of the picture in terms of
Mhm.
winning. And Garfield, I don't think even quite it did well because there hadn't been a kids movie in a while, but I don't think it has lived up to kind of the hype on that. Um, I not to rain on PT's parade, but the reactions I saw to War of the Rohirrim were, that's much more anime than I expected. And I think that was often used in the pejorative, as in, oh, that's
Aw.
not for me because it's much more anime than I expected. And that's unfair, and people should open their minds, myself included. It should be more open. My nieces are anime obsessed, and I accidentally asked them a question about anime and got 30 minutes of really hardcore teenage girl intensity about it that I felt totally unprepared for. But I think it's Inside Out two's award to lose unless something really stellar. Well, Wild Robot is the one to watch. I think you nailed that exactly right.
Yeah, now I'm trying to think what else is coming out for the rest of the year that could be a contender for an animated feature. I think there's another Wallace and Gromit movie coming out at some point.
Well, That would be the last one because they're running out of clay. I don't know if you heard about this.
Wait, what?
Yeah, they literally they use a special kind of material to make the puppets at Aardman, and they only have enough for one more movie. It's like not made anymore, and they can't do it.
Why
People should
can't they
Google
make
this
more?
to get the full details. I don't remember all the express details, but Aardman has said this will be the last kind of claymation animated thing they do. So
What?
that has last Miyazaki vibes to it, but it
Right,
felt
right,
like
right.
when
Like,
when everybody said Polaroid is going away and you can't get Polaroid cameras anymore, and now suddenly they're back. So it might be overplaying their hand.
yeah, I was gonna say, is that them fishing for a sponsor to buy them more clay? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know. Okay, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Wild Robot to me looks really good. I don't know. I'm excited for that movie.
My son is very excited. That's a great book that both he and my wife love.
Oh, I've heard that. Yeah,
yeah.
I'm gonna have to check that out. All right. Well, I think we did it. We've checked in on Pixar thoroughly. Thank you so much, Greg, for hopping on to talk about this one. This is one we kind of went back and forth, like, oh, do we actually want to do a review for it? I'm really glad we did. Because especially if it's such a huge box office hit throughout the summer, like we would have regretted it probably if we hadn't. But you've been, other than seeing this movie, you've been super busy with lots of podcasts. So why don't you tell us where folks can find your work and what you're working on?
Well, yes, thank you for this, and it really feels like if we're gonna, Oscar pools are won or lost in the small categories, and don't forget about the animated feature category, exactly like you just said. So thank you for having me on. And I'm reviewing The Acolyte, the new Star Wars show, which is divisive amongst the general public, I guess is the safe way to say that. And you can find me doing reviews of that on the Rebel base card feed for Acolyte and Fluffy Breakfast is what it is called. And then I was a guest last week on the Wampa's Lair talking about the mythology of the Phantom Menace, one of the last Phantom Menace episodes of extended Phantom Menace month. Although, let's be honest, that show's about a third about Phantom Menace all the time, which I say with love. So those are good times. And the mythology discussion was really fun because so much is written about like what the original trilogy does with Joseph Campbell and kind of archetypes. It really felt like a fresh discussion. I brought classical mythology. Carl, the co-host, brought Christian mythology, and we just had a good time. So highly recommended if people haven't gotten enough Phantom Menace coverage here. But Jen, you're also talking Acolyte on your Substack, and where else can people find you?
Yeah, so it's funny. I often don't plug my written reviews on here, but I guess I should. So yeah, I'm actually doing weekly reviews of The Acolyte on the longtake.substack.com, which is also where you can find our episodes, as you get 2 for 1. But House of the Dragon also started up season 2. So I'm gonna try to do reviews for that as well. We'll see. I think if push comes to shove, Acolyte is gonna take precedent, but that's kind of written wise. That's what I'm going to be working on. And you can find me on Instagram and Threads at Sopchockchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI, and you can find me on Letterboxd at Qui-Gon Jinn. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Long Take Review on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive new podcast episodes, as well as written reviews of films with Oscar buzz and new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.